divorcee and a head-turning high schooler aren't just mother and daughter. They're best friends.
When kids get to be teenagers, sometimes they pull away a little bit, don't like all that stuff. But they were very close.
The only thing that can tear them apart is a horrific act of violence.
She was lying face down with a extension cord twisted around her neck.
The officer just spun around and said, "Everybody out."
As you can see the blood pooling on the carpet, it's horrific.
It was total shock to learn that your sister had been murdered and your niece was missing.
There was just so many what is. She could be the next victim. Time was of the essence to find her.
But who would have been driven to cause such a horrifying and violent scene?
He still wanted to be dating her. That, I believe, was the cause of the animosity.
He was jealous, made no bones about it. He wanted to fight.
Hutchinson, Kansas, March 30th, 1998. A phone call interrupts morning coffee for Pat Douglas and her husband, Bill. The call is from the workplace of Pat's sister, 48-year-old Sandra Miles.
Sandy had not been at work for several days, and it was not like her to not call in. So my husband and I went to her home to investigate, see what was going on. All the doors were locked. We didn't want to break in because we didn't know that if there was a reason to yet. So we thought we would go to the high school and see if Tracie was at school.
Tracie Miles is Sandra's 17-year-old daughter, a sophomore at Hutchinson High School.
When we got to the high school, they brought the resource officer out to talk to us. Officer Wilson let us know that Tracie was not in school.
In fact, they are informed that Tracie hasn't been at school for days.
I think I was getting a little more anxious by then. Officer Wilson said he would drive to Sandra's house. Husband and I could follow.
On the way to Sandra's house, Pat, Bill, and Officer Wilson get a key from Pat and Sandra's father.
The moment we walked in the door, we knew something was bad because of the odor. The officer just spun around and said, "Everybody out."
He immediately called in on his radio that he needed assistance at the residence without putting too much over the air.
Officer Wilson had, in his tone of his voice, I can tell that something was wrong when I got the call.
Inside the house, police discovered the decaying body of a middle-aged woman. Her head covered by a blanket.
The strong odor decomposition told me that the unidentified body at that time had been laying there for a few days.
All I knew at the time was it had to be her. It had to be my sister.
Sandra K. Werther began life in the post-war American heartland.
I was born on August 18th, 1946, and Sandy was born on May 26th, 1949.
I'm the oldest sister. Sandra was the youngest, and Edie is the middle sister. We were raised in Chase, Kansas, a little town, and it was a wonderful childhood.
Many kids played outside. You know, we could walk to school, we could walk home without any threat.
Soon after high school, Sandra sought to start a family. But after 2 failed marriages, she found herself raising her son Chad on her own. In 1976, the single mom took a job at the Eaton Corporation, a factory that produced pistons and gear pumps.
She was a very good worker. They enjoyed her. And that is where she met her next husband, Jerry Miles.
Jerry was very outgoing And that's why Sandra was so attracted to him. And Sandy and Jerry, after they met, they got married pretty quickly. Sandy seemed very happy.
Jerry legally adopted Chad, and soon the couple were expecting a baby of their own. In September of 1980, they welcomed a daughter, Tracie Lynn Miles.
Sandy was very excited to have a little girl.
Tracie's so sweet. She was beautiful, had a big smile. Every time that she would walk into the room, you're like, oh, Tracie's here. He was a great dad. He always took Tracie and Chad to the lake, spent quality time with them. He loved them more than anything.
Sandra always liked to have a family dinner where she'd cook everything and have the family all together.
But their happy home was eventually shattered by addiction.
Sandra was married to Jerry 7 years. He was an alcoholic, and that just ruined the marriage.
I always saw him as a good husband and a good dad. When they got divorced, I was surprised.
After Sandy's divorce from Jerry, it was very difficult for her as a single mother to take care of 2 kids and go to a job daily, and she handled it pretty well. She still gave plenty of time and attention to her children. She was a loving mother.
Hardship brought mother and daughter closer together.
Tracie and Sandy were so close that Tracie would walk up and sit on her mother's lap or hugging on her. When kids get to be teenagers, sometimes they pull away a little bit, but they were very close.
Tracie, she didn't like it that her mother had to work so many hours, but she once told me my mother's doing it for me.
By the spring of 1997, 16-year-old Tracie started dating, and she and Sandra began to butt heads.
Sandy clearly did not like Tracie's boyfriends, and that was a bone of contention.
But as is typical for teenage romance, Tracie's relationships were fickle. After calling a truce with Tracie, Sandra surprised her daughter with a gift, a black Ford Mustang.
I think all of our family was into cars at that time, so having a Mustang was a really big deal.
Tracie was always the first student out into that parking lot. And it's like, is she waiting by the door already or what? And she'd get in her car and she would just take off.
The future was looking bright for Sandra Miles and her children. To top it off, in March of 1998, Sandra's 22-year-old son Chad and his girlfriend Mindy shared some wonderful news.
Mindy was pregnant, and Sandy was so excited that she was going to have a grandchild.
Sadly, Sandra wouldn't live to become a proud grandparent. On March 30th, 1998, Hutchinson homicide detectives respond to find Sandra's partially decomposed body on the floor.
Known to me as a decaying body.
Detectives carefully remove the blanket covering her head and make a disturbing discovery.
She was lying face down with a stitching cord twisted around her neck, and her head had been struck several times with some kind of an unknown object.
It was clear at that point it was not a natural death. It was immediately thought to be a homicide.
Police now fear that Sandra's daughter, who hasn't been seen at school in days, is also a victim.
We were looking for a Tracie to see if she possibly was deceased in the house.
Tracie could have very well been a murder victim herself.
An exhaustive search of the home confirms only one body. Now investigators have 2 mysteries: a murdered mother and her missing daughter.
We had to try and find Tracie. She might be seriously harmed or injured or killed somewhere, and you had to do everything in your power to investigate that.
Coming up, a police pursuit sends the case in a surprising new direction.
There was a red vehicle that backed out of the driveway and left at a high rate of speed. Sergeant Hoover gave chase to the vehicle.
I was absolutely shocked. Who could hurt this sweet woman?
On March 30th, 1998, detectives in Hutchinson, Kansas, launch a two-pronged investigation into the brutal killing of 48-year-old mother Sandra Miles and the disappearance of Sandra's 17-year-old daughter, Tracie.
Total shock to learn over the phone that your sister had been murdered and possibly your niece was missing.
The residence was well kept, very quiet neighborhood, and when this tragedy happened, it really shocked the neighborhood.
A preliminary exam of the body reveals just how violent Sandra's last moments must have been.
The cord around the neck. It appeared to be some sort of electrical cord that went to an appliance. My guess was she was laying on the floor, face from behind. I saw bloodstains from the blunt force trauma to her head. It was a pretty severe beating.
The first thought was that it was an aggravated burglary, and Sandra just happened to be there at the wrong time.
A closer examination of the scene suggests this was no robbery.
From appearance, there's no forced entry because the door was locked prior to me being called there.
Based on the sheer brutality of Sandra's injuries, detectives believe the crime was personal.
When you see that, there's been severe trauma to the upper body and it's been covered. They want to disassociate themselves from that person. That's usually a telltale sign that the victim knew the attacker and vice versa.
Police officers have been sent out to question family members. They're trying to locate all the friends, so you're trying to find any possible person who could be involved with the situation, looking at ex-husbands, friends, anyone that Sandra had had problems with.
Hutchinson police meet with Sandra's family first.
The whole family was very concerned about Tracie and concerned that she had been abducted and was, possibly a victim also.
Sandra's sister tells police that she last saw Sandra alive and well 5 days before, around the same time Tracie was last seen in school.
The body had been found on the 30th, and with the decomposition and the rigor mortis, then it's easy to go back. It couldn't have happened before the 25th, but it had to happen pretty quick to that date.
And while the house doesn't appear to have been robbed, there's one glaring absence.
We did find out there's a black Mustang that Tracie drives, and it's missing. Sandra Miles had given it to her daughter.
Family members say that Sandra didn't have enemies.
Sandy was just a good person and did well with making friends. She was very friendly to people.
There's no sign of a murder weapon, no suggestion of motive, and barely a handful of clues.
At that point, you look at any family member, you look at ex-husbands, boyfriends. Since we can't find Tracie, looking at her friends, so we're trying to track down anyone who had any contact with either of the Miles. In a small town the size of Hutchinson, word spreads quick.
I was absolutely shocked.
Once we put the crime tape up, there was a large gathering around the area as what I call looky-loos, people just standing and watching, seeing what's going on.
Among those crowding the crime scene tape is Marion Mock, a neighbor from across the street. He tells police that he last saw Tracie 5 days ago on March 25th, with 2 teenage friends.
Marion Mock had seen Tracie get in a pickup truck with one of the boys So that obviously is something that had to be checked out immediately.
The friend's name is Mark Long Jr., and he lives near the Miles residence.
Sergeant Hoover went to Mark's residence, wanted to talk to him. Once they got there was a red vehicle that backed out of the driveway and left at a high rate of speed. Sergeant Hoover gave chase to the vehicle.
Instead of making for the highway, the driver turns a sharp corner, coming to an abrupt stop near the Miles residence. Pursuing police order the driver and his single passenger out of the vehicle.
Mark Long Jr. was driving the car, and once he was stopped, they put him in a patrol unit. My first instinct as a police officer, I'm thinking the person operating that car has something to hide.
Officers cuff Mark and his friend and immediately transport them to the station for questioning. Inside an interview room, Mark says he was just another worried friend.
Mark Long heard something horrific happened at Sandra's house, and he was concerned about Sandra and Tracie.
The police thought they were trying to run, and it turns out that the boys had heard about what had occurred, and they were upset, trying to come down there.
Mark denies knowing anything about either the murder or Tracie's whereabouts. Mark's friend has the same story, and police have no choice but to let the teenage boys go.
There was nothing to indicate that they were involved in any way.
When police talk to friends who are closer to Tracie, they learn of someone who could be involved. Tracie's ex-boyfriend, Jeremy Bell.
Sandra did not like him, and she felt that Jeremy was leading Tracie down a bad path in her life.
The relationship with Jeremy Bell had been tumultuous.
Tracie and Jeremy had started dating after
Tracie had just recently broke up with Jeremy Bell and went back to seeing Paul.
We were told Jeremy was very, very angry over the situation of Tracie dating Paul Nelson.
Among the various friends, there were statements made that they had overheard Jeremy say he was going to kill Paul.
Police find out that Paul wasn't the only person that Jeremy blamed for the breakup.
Jeremy did not like Sandra because Sandra did not want Jeremy at her house around her daughter Tracie, because Sandra felt Jeremy was not good for her.
Rumors swirled that Jeremy's threats scared Sandra enough to seek a restraining order against him.
Some of the people that Jeremy Bell hung around with said he had mentioned that he wanted to hurt or kill Sandra because of Sandra's keeping him away from Tracie.
It was something that threw a big red flag up, and he was clearly in the sights of law enforcement.
This new information also heightens concerns for Tracie.
Time was of the essence to find her.
Coming up, was Sandra Miles in the wrong place at the wrong time?
He might have went there looking for Tracie and instead found Sandra.
He strongly felt Tracie was being held against her will.
And detectives uncover a secret that might be worth killing for.
Ian was the father. There was no question about that in anybody's mind.
Detectives in Hutchinson, Kansas, are investigating the murder of Sandra Miles, as well as the disappearance of her daughter, Tracie Miles. They now have a potential suspect, Tracie's ex, Jeremy Bell. When detectives pull his file, they find that Jeremy had a violent connection to Tracie's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Paul Nelson.
Both Jeremy Bell and his friend William Lemunion had both been put in jail for violent acts and burglary involving Paul Nelson. So clearly that was a big red flag.
Jeremy Bell and Billy Lemunion were arrested for the attack of Paul's roommate.
They were put in jail on the 21st, I believe, and had got out just right.
In 24 hours of Sandra's brutal murder, detectives scour Sandra's phone records and discover that Jeremy Bell had called the Miles home on the evening of March 25th, the last day Sandra was seen alive.
Jeremy became a possible prime suspect. He might have went there looking for Tracie and instead found Sandra at home.
Law enforcement really jumped on finding Jeremy Bell and Mr. Lemunion, and they both interviewed.
Billy Lemunion denies any involvement in the crime. What's more, he has an airtight alibi for the period when Sandra was killed.
Billy, he actually turned out to be a pretty decent kid after a while.
When detectives turn their attention to Jeremy Bell, he freely admits to despising Paul Nelson.
Jeremy was jealous. He got apparently upset easily, made no bones about it. He wanted to fight Paul.
Jeremy still wanted to be dating her, and she was with Paul. That, I believe, was the cause of the animosity.
Jeremy insists that he would never harm Tracie. In fact, he says he was worried about her.
He certainly just indicated how much he disliked Mr. Nelson and tried to indicate Mr. Nelson had got Tracie involved in drugs.
Jeremy Bell admits that he called the Miles home on March 25th.
Jeremy had called and spoken to Sandra the night before the homicide and had made threats in regards to Paul Nelson, and Sandy had hung up on Jeremy.
According to Jeremy, it was the last time he ever spoke with Sandra.
You have to take anything in that statement with a grain of salt because people are giving their own versions. Jeremy was checked out thoroughly. He gave it where he had been. That was verified.
Jeremy was released as a possible suspect.
At the same time, the coroner sends over the final autopsy results for Sandra Miles.
It indicated the most likely time that the murder would have occurred would have been on the 26th. The autopsy showed there were 4 severe blows to the head with a blunt object.
She actually died of strangulation, but that the blows to the head would have became fatal. Somebody wanted to make overkill on Sandra Miles. That pointed in the direction that it was a personal crime, that Sandra might have been targeted.
After speaking with Jeremy, police need to track down Tracie's current boyfriend, Paul Nelson. When police contact Paul's parents, they say that their troubled son hasn't been home for over a week. The last time he came by, he brought his friend with him, 18-year-old Jeremy Zwickle.
Tracie's best friend was Candace Canal. Her boyfriend was Jeremy Zwickle. Jeremy Zwickle had allowed Paul to stay at his house for several nights for some period of time. There was a friendship there.
Investigators reach out to Jeremy Zwickle. Zwickle says that Paul hasn't been there since March 26th.
Paul was missing too. Like, okay, wait a minute here. Something's not right.
Jeremy Zwickle admits that Sandra Miles had been concerned about Tracie and Paul's relationship.
Tracie's mom clearly did not like Tracie dating Paul. She did not think he was a good influence on Tracie.
He was told not to come to the house and to stay away from Tracie.
Being forbidden to see him only drew Tracie closer to Paul. The two took every opportunity to sneak off together. In the summer of 1997, after weeks of meeting Paul in secret, Tracie received startling news.
About a year before the homicide, Tracie had gotten pregnant. Paul Nelson was the father. There was no question about that in anybody's mind.
Paul was so thrilled he wanted a permanent reminder.
He had a tattoo indicating that he was a daddy.
His baby's future grandmother had a very different reaction.
Sandy had told Tracie, if you don't get an abortion, you're going to have to move out and take care of the baby. Tracie made the decision to go to Wichita and get the abortion.
Paul was left with a constant reminder of the loss, a tattoo that said, Daddy P.
Clearly there was not a good relationship between Sandy and Paul Nelson.
Jeremy Zwickel says that the last time he saw Paul on March 26th, Paul came to the house around 10 a.m. and started packing his clothes. Zwickel says Paul was planning a trip and had the cash to fund the journey.
Jeremy Zwickel was aware of the fact that Paul had $2,000, that Paul was leaving in Tracie's Mustang to go to Mexico.
He said that he had went to his house and secured a VCR and took it to the pawn shop so that he would have travel money.
A search of local pawn shops reveals that Paul did swap a VCR for about $50. And that's not all. The VCR matches one that was missing from the Miles residence.
According to what I understood of the layout of the house, he would have had to either walk by Sandy's body or step over it to get the VCR.
The VCR gives detectives clear evidence tying Paul Nelson to the crime scene. But where did the rest of his $2,000 come from? And did Paul make the 750-mile trip to Mexico alone?
Chad, Tracie's brother, was interviewed by the Hutch News, and he strongly felt at that time Tracie was being held against her will.
Where was the black Mustang? Was Tracie safe in it, or was she being held against her will in it?
There was just so many what-ifs, so we had to find her real quick.
Coming up, a nationwide manhunt builds to a shocking climax.
The authorities were contacted nationwide to be on the lookout.
They were acting as if they were dangerous people.
We wanted them back in Kansas as quickly as we could get them.
Kansas investigators are on the trail of 18-year-old Paul Nelson, the #1 suspect in the brutal murder of 48-year-old Sandra Miles and the disappearance of her teenage daughter, Tracie Miles.
The police had told us since Tracie was missing, they thought that her boyfriend had abducted her.
Police have learned that Paul had over $2,000 cash on him before he left town. When detectives check into Sandra's bank account, they make a stunning discovery. A personal check for $2,000 was cashed from Sandra's account on March 26th, the day Sandra died. But detectives learn Paul wasn't acting alone.
Tracie had gone to a bank with Paul, and they cashed a check.
She indicated to the teller that the money was being given to her by her mother to help purchase a car. The teller had no distress or anything at that point.
Could Tracie be more than an innocent victim?
We knew she hadn't been at school, and we were told about her best friend, Candace, so a great effort was made to find Candace as quickly as possible.
Investigators locate Candace at her mother's house and ask her to come to the station. Candace confirms that dating Paul drove a sharp wedge between Tracie and her mom.
Tracie didn't want to take orders. She wanted to do what she wanted to do. If she didn't get her way, she would throw a tantrum.
Tracie and Sandy were having arguments almost continually about Paul and his relationship with Tracie.
According to Candace, on the evening of March 25th, 1998, Tracie called Candace to say that she and Sandra had just had their worst argument yet. But it wasn't about Paul or her pregnancy.
Sandy had taken away Tracie's keys to the Mustang. The insurance company had contacted Sandy and said, we're going to raise your insurance rates significantly because of the amount of tickets that Tracie's gotten.
I think there was quite a bit of animosity brewing in Tracie over that.
Everyone who knew Tracie said that was one of the most important things in her life was her Mustang.
When Candace arrived at the Miles home to pick Tracie up for school early the next morning, Tracie brought her up to her bedroom, where Paul Nelson sat on Tracie's bed.
Paul told him not to come to the house, but sometime during the night, Tracie allowed him to come into the house through the window through her bedroom.
Tracie had decided it was time to leave or she was going to lose her car.
Candace took Tracie to a mutual friend's house. Then, around 8 a.m., she says that Tracie got a phone call from Paul.
Paul told Tracie that she could come back to the house. When he told her that, she was happy about that information.
Candace says when she pulled into the driveway of Tracie's house to drop off her friend, Paul was waiting by the front door, shirtless.
She was under the assumption that Tracie and Paul were going to run off and live together.
Candace says she assumed Sandra was at work, but as she left, she noticed something odd. Sandra's car was still in the garage.
Tracie was not a kidnapped victim at all. She was a participant in this crime. Wanted. Authorities were contacted nationwide to be on the lookout for Tracie and Paul.
Friends and family cannot believe it.
She was on America's Most Wanted with Paul, and they were acting as if they were dangerous people, and I knew that the Tracie I knew would never be capable of doing anything like this. Sandra was one of her best friends. She loved her mother.
I was so concerned about Tracie, but I knew the truth will prevail. It will come out. Just wait to see what happens.
On April 1st, 1998, just 2 days after Sandra's body was found, a U.S. Customs investigator contacts the Kansas Bureau of Investigation.
Tracie and Paul came back across the border into El Paso from Mexico, and that was verified through the video from Customs.
According to the customs investigator, Tracie told a U.S. border guard that she and Paul were visiting Texas for spring break and had just driven across the border to Juarez for lunch.
They had no reason to stop them at that time. We verified that they in fact had been in Texas.
Knowing Paul and Tracie were on the run together doesn't make them any easier to find. Until, on April 8th, 1998, Candace reaches out to investigators again.
We received information that Tracie had called Candy.
She had the number on the caller ID. She gave that number to Agent Newsom.
Detectives trace the number to an address in El Paso, Texas. Moments later, they're on the phone with El Paso police.
We wanted them back in Kansas as quickly as we could get them.
Coming up, investigators have one shot at a confession.
I believe that there is a small part of humanity in him.
But who is telling the truth?
He became enraged, and he just charged her in the door.
On the evening of April 8th, 1998, local police knock on an apartment door on the outskirts of El Paso. They are there to apprehend 18-year-old Paul Nelson and 17-year-old Tracie Miles.
Tracie had made a phone call back to Hutchinson, and it was traced back to El Paso, Texas. And that was the key to their whereabouts.
One of them, Tracie or Paul, answered the door and they were immediately arrested without incident.
The following day, investigators questioned Paul Nelson in an interview room at the El Paso jail.
Paul Nelson, he obviously was very emotional, was frightened, scared.
Paul Nelson told me that the last time that he had seen Sandra, she was okay. He said that he had went to his house and secured a VCR and took it to the pawn shop so they would have travel money. I said, okay, Paul, you don't think that we came all the way to El Paso, Texas to talk to you about a VCR? At that time, Paul Nelson started quivering, looked down, said, no, I didn't. To me, that was an admission of guilt.
Paul confirms that on the night of March 25th, 1998, Tracie snuck him into her bedroom.
Tracie was upset with the mother about her car being taken away, and they feared that Sandra would come looking for them if they ran away.
According to Paul, that's when Tracie suggested a drastic solution.
The planning of this murder happened the night Paul crawled through Tracie's window and they sat there and discussed it. Their process was to kill her so that Sandra wouldn't come looking for Tracie.
Paul spent the night in her bedroom. The following morning, Candace came over, picked up Tracie. She was going to go to school.
Paul remained hidden in her bedroom with a wooden bear statue he had taken from the living room. Once Sandra thought she was alone in the house, Paul would use it to knock her out. But, Paul says, as the minutes went by, he began to lose his nerve.
Paul was having second thoughts about it. I believe that there was a small part of humanity in him where he didn't want to do this. He backed out.
Until, Paul says, Sandra flung open the door and surprised him.
Sandy had caught him in the bedroom. She became angry.
She had first asked him what the heck he was doing there, called him some nasty names, told him to get out of the house. He became and charged her in the door, hit her.
He said he struck her several times with the carving and got sick to his stomach.
Paul hid the weapon in Sandra's backyard, then called Tracie, who arrived moments later.
They noticed that Sandy was still showing signs of life. Paul indicated that he went into the restroom and in fact threw up at that point.
When he physically got sick, he came back out of the bathroom and then Sandra was dead and her upper torso was covered.
Paul believed he'd killed Sandra until Tracie made a shocking confession right before their arrest.
Tracie indicated she went into the bedroom, took the cord off of her radio, went back, strangled her mother, put the blanket over her.
KBI investigators fly Paul and Tracie back to Kansas to stand trial. En route home, KBI agent Newsom presses Tracie for her side of the story.
Tracie was very calm during the interview, certainly admitted that they jointly decided to commit the homicide. When they got to the point about the strangulation with the cord, Tracie kind of laughed or giggled and said, okay, I did it. Tracie was matter-of-fact about what had occurred.
While Paul and Tracie fly back to Kansas, Hutchinson PD search the Miles' backyard.
The murder weapon was found hidden underneath a turned-over picnic table.
And there was blood on the bear statue.
Tracie and Paul are charged with first-degree murder. They both face life in prison if found guilty.
Paul's defense didn't dispute the killing had taken place. but that it was a spur-of-the-moment crime and he should be found guilty of voluntary manslaughter and not first-degree murder. Tracie's argument, she changed back, that Paul was the main instigator and that Paul had done the strangulation, and she played a minor role.
Neither Paul nor Tracie have to convince a jury. On February 26, 1999, they each enter no contest guilty pleas in the murder of Sandra Miles.
Both attorneys recognized there was no defense. The evidence is so overwhelming that you know you can't win at a jury trial.
It was very emotional and hard for our family to see Tracie give them the harshest penalty possible.
On April 22, 1999, a judge sentences both teens to life in prison with a minimum 25 years to serve.
Tracie just stood there. She was just in so much shock, so traumatized.
Paul made an obscene gesture to the judge, and he was just taken out.
Before being shipped off to state prison, Tracie meets with her family one last time in a holding cell in the courthouse.
We asked Tracie why, and she just refused to answer us. Tracie never took responsibility for her actions and said that she was sorry for what happened to her mother.
Friends, family, and law enforcement are left trying to understand how a set of car keys could turn a doting daughter into a killer.
It's self-entitlement, and that's what was the death of Sandra Miles. Self-entitlement in a vehicle.
They're going to be due for parole in several years, and I've thought about that, and I really don't want either one of them to get out and be able to walk the street where my sister can't ever do that again.
To kill your mother because your car was being taken away, I just can't get my mind around that.
You ask yourself, why? Why would a child who loved her mother, why would she be involved in her murder? And you just don't understand it. And I don't think we ever will.
For more information on Snapped, go to oxygen.com.